something people used to get very upset about. Nowadays, few people have even heard of it. But, even 10 years ago, people would come in and be like, but the Children's Crusade! So, it's another one of those things that we have to understand properly. It used to be very common to hear tales of a children's crusade, which was supposedly a movement to send children into the Holy Land to convert the Muslims peacefully. The veracity of the stories of this quote-unquote crusade are in dispute, and actually that's putting it mildly. It's been utterly debunked by most reputable modern historians, although they have been widely believed for a long time. A study by a leading Dutch medievalist, Peter Retst, published in 1977, began to cast doubt on the traditional narration of these events. Retst pointed out that the term Children's Crusade never appeared in any sources from the time when they supposedly would have taken place. Moreover, no pope ever called for a crusade of children. There are records, church records of all of the crusades, all of the documents that the Pope put forth, all of the calls for crusaders that the Pope put forth. There's no record of a Pope ever calling for children to go on crusade. Retst mentions that such sources describe participation in crusading movements by people of all ages, children, adults, even the elderly, but that there's no evidence that children made up a prevalent part of these migrations. Retst therefore classes the Children's Crusade with the widespread movement of People's Crusades migrations of very poor landless men and women who were taken up by the enthusiasm of the crusading movement and began to migrate across Europe. Most of them never got to the Holy Land. Most of them just ended up going from one part of Europe to another. So most of these people didn't make it out of Europe. Many died of disease or starvation as they attempted their journey. Some were victimized by criminals and were taken abroad on ships and sold into slavery. Some ended up doing really well for themselves. Some found work and made better lives in Italy. There are people today who purport to be descendants of these people. Some gave up and went back home. But there's absolutely no historical evidence that there were mass migrations of children. So, the classic story. If you were a child when I was a child, you might have read this in a history textbook and gone, what? Sounds like a fairy tale. And it turns out that's really what it is. As the story goes, in the year 1212, thousands of children in Central Europe set off for Jerusalem. Their aim was to liberate the holy city from the Saracens without weapons, merely by the power of their faith. They were supposedly led by a boy who began to preach in France or Germany, claiming that he had been visited by Jesus and was told to lead a crusade to peacefully liberate Jerusalem. Through preaching and miracles, so the story goes, he gained a following of up to 30,000 children. He led the children south toward the Mediterranean Sea, believing that the sea would part and allow them to march to Jerusalem. The story does not have a happy ending. The undertaking supposedly ended in chaos, and those who didn't starve to death or die of exhaustion while crossing the Alps were sold to slave ships on arrival in the Mediterranean or died of fever and disease. So yeah, not great PR. This story that the Pope called a crusade of children and they all ended up dead or sold into slavery. As has been the case with many myths of the Crusades, modern scholarship has completely debunked the story, utterly obliterated it. According to modern researchers, this story arose by combining some of the details of two movements that did indeed arise, one in Germany and one in France. There was a shift in the attitudes of European Christians as there were calls for crusades beyond the Third Crusade. Even after many had gone to fight in the East, Jerusalem was not retaken by crusaders, and medieval Christians largely came to the conclusion that Jerusalem was not retaken because God was not pleased with those who were going to the East to fight these battles. At the same time, there was an underlying attitude among medieval Christians that God gave special attention to the prayers of the poor and the humble most especially. And some enthusiastic preachers began to preach a new kind of crusade, one that consisted of armies made up of the poor, women, children, and the elderly. The idea behind this was that the prayers of these people would please God especially, and so he would deliver Jerusalem on their account. Now note well, this was a movement among the general populace. This was not coming down from the top in the church. This was never sanctioned by the church. No pope ever called for these kinds of movements. Some of the clergy who, if you will recall, were largely uneducated at this time, supported the movement. And at first, those who tried to temper the movement with words of caution were largely ignored. This came about as a result of medieval popular piety and enthusiasm drummed up by young and charismatic preachers. All right, so in Germany in 1212, a very pious young man named Nicholas went about in the style of a crusade preacher, and he attracted many followers as he called them to join him in an expedition to liberate Jerusalem. Nicholas claimed that when they reached the shores of Italy, the sea would part and allow them to cross into the Holy Land. So that's where that part of the story came from. He claimed that the Muslim kingdoms would be defeated not by the Crusader sword, but by converting to Christianity. His disciples preached this message and called the people to this crusade across German lands. It's worthy to note that the people that Nicholas gathered were not children nor even young teenagers. This expedition included a wide cross-section of society: urban workers, elderly men and women, mothers with infants, and even entire families. That's where that idea of children would come from. There were children, but not like unaccompanied children, marching without their parents. There were some young teenagers and even children, but this was by no stretch of the imagination anything resembling an army of children. And what this expedition did not include were armed warriors, nor papal representation. There was always a papal representative that went on the actual crusades. After gathering, the group split into two and moved across the Alps into Italy. Many died on this treacherous journey. When they arrived at the sea in Genoa, Italy, they expected the waters to divide before them. Guess what? It didn't happen. The seas did not part. The authorities in the city were impressed by this band of crusaders who had walked all the way from Germany across the Alps, and they offered them work and citizenship in their city. Many took the opportunity and ended up doing quite well for themselves. So that's a little bit of a happy ending that comes from this movement among the people. Nicholas traveled to Pisa, and he and some of his followers met Pope Innocent III, who urged them to return home to their families. Unfortunately, a group of the Crusaders fell in with a band of ruffians. These men promised them passage to Jerusalem by sea, but they took them instead to Egypt and sold them into slavery. So that's where that part of the story comes from. Did people get sold into slavery? Yes, they did. But again, it was not an army of children that the Pope sent off to the Holy Land. There are several different stories of what happened to Nicholas next. One such story claims Nicholas died on the journey home, and his father was arrested and hanged by angry families whose relatives had died while following him. Another posits that Pope Innocent III did not release Nicholas from his crusader vow, and that he was last seen at the port of Brindisi looking for transport to the Holy Land. He might have fulfilled his vow in the Fifth Crusade. Nobody really knows. We don't have a record. All right, at the same time, going back, between Easter and Pentecost in 1212, a group of young people in the Chartrain region of France, motivated by religious fervor, took the cross. The movement grew in strength and numbers when a charismatic young man named Stephen became its de facto leader. Stephen was a shepherd who believed that Jesus had appeared to him and given him letters to be delivered to King Philip II Augustus in Paris. Large groups of young people around his age were drawn to Stephen. So that again is where we get the idea of children. And they claim that he had special gifts of God. Stephen attracted a large following of both adults and children. When they arrived in Paris, members of the group requested to see the king. The king came out. He thanked Stephen for the letter. And then he promptly urged the whole lot of them to go home. And they did. They did go home. Disappointed by the king's response, many of the French youth complied, and Stephen's crusade ended. Others ignored the command and continued their procession eastward to the Rhineland, and some of them may have met up with the German contingency led by Nicholas. And it really was from this movement of deeply pious people, yes, many of them were young, who became enthralled with the crusading fervor of their time, and so marched around France or from Germany to Italy, that the myth of the Children's Crusade came forth. I think the real story is way more interesting than the one that's kind of been spun from it. But yeah, there never was the Pope having sent children off to be, murdered. That wouldn't be good. Okay.